welcome to Tech 24 for a special edition dedicated to the situation in Afghanistan. The Taliban could be in possession of a U.S. military biometrics device holding the fingerprints and face ID of thousands of Afghan civilians. Former U.S. military personnel say this sensitive data could help in the identification of Afghans who assisted coalition forces. And in Test 24, as the Paralympics take place in Tokyo, Peter O'Brien will share with us a selection of some of the best innovations to make more sports available to people with disabilities. Now, among those Afghans fleeing the country since the Taliban took control, an all-girl robotics team. The young women, some of whom are in their teens, fled among fears that the Taliban would not allow them to pursue their education. The group of budding engineers had previously won international prizes for their innovations. Olivia Salazar-Winspear has this report.
Touching down to safety and free to continue their personal and professional journeys in science. Members of the Afghan girls' robotics team arrived in Mexico this week, where they've been offered humanitarian visas since fleeing the Taliban earlier this month. Many of these engineering apprentices are still in their teens and are determined to continue with their studies.
And we are really grateful for Mexican government to save our lives, and we will from now on we will even have more opportunities to have more achievements in our lives.
Other members of the team made a stopover in Qatar, where they discussed the difficulty of leaving home. Some barely had time to say goodbye.
We left our family. I'm so sorry.
No, take your time.
And it was so hard for us because our family there and our country destroyed.
The Afghan all-girl robotics team have won international awards for their innovations in the past, scoring first prize at the Robotics Festival in Estonia for a solar-powered system to support small-scale farming. In 2017, they came to wider attention, participating in the first Global Challenge Robotics competition in Washington, with last-minute visas granted by US authorities. More recently, the girls turned their attention to the worldwide health crisis, designing a low-cost ventilator for COVID patients, a mechanism built with sustainability in mind, making use of old car parts.
Let's now welcome Peter O'Brien, our tech editor. Hello, Peter. Good to have you back.
Hi, Julia.
So we've just seen this beautiful report about these very strong, courageous women who are pursuing their dreams despite the difficult circumstances. Now, their success actually earned them the support of the previous Afghan government, which was helping them build the Dreamer Institute at Kabul University. What will happen with this project?
Well, we're not sure. The Taliban have said that they'll let women go to school and go to work, but under Islamic law. And there's major questions about what this means because, of course, under the last regime, they couldn't even leave the house without a male guardian. The Dreamer Institute that you mentioned was being designed by Yale University. This was meant to be a secondary school and an innovation center which would focus on blockchain, artificial intelligence and robotics, and crucially provide lots of opportunities for girls. There it is on the Yale website. It's sort of inspired by this Mirar Education Complex, a school for women and girls in Kabul, which has been really one of the drivers behind STEM for women in Afghanistan over the last 5 years. It offered university degrees in medicine and computer science. Before the Taliban took power, it had hundreds of women at its schools and university, many of whom were mothers, and they wouldn't have been able to get education otherwise. Now, though, its president, Azazullah Amir, says the Taliban recently instructed all universities in that area to close, so we're really not sure what the future holds for these projects.
Now, Peter, let's touch on another topic. As the U.S., of course, retreats, China and Russia now are eyeing the country. There's a big prize, of course. Afghanistan holds an estimated 1.4 million tons of rare earth minerals. This is actually crucial in the development of, for instance, automatic vehicles, but also renewable energy technology.
Yeah, that's right. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there's about $1 trillion worth of untapped minerals under the Afghan soil. And it's not just the rare earths you mentioned, but there's tons and tons of bauxite, iron ore, copper and lithium. Copper, of course, used in power cables, lithium used in batteries, things like electric cars, wind farms, solar panels. Prices soared for copper this year, and they're expected to soar for lithium. I mean, that demand for lithium is supposed to grow by about 40 times over the next 2 decades. Who's going to do business with the Taliban, though? Well, as you mentioned, potentially China seems to be one willing customer. Its huge mining company won rights to exploit the Mez Aynak copper deposit, which you can see here, back in 2007. And the group is now considering beginning operations if the political situation stabilizes, but that's a big if.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. Now, another worrying development in the tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan, the U.S. biometric database dubbed HIDE that was given by Washington to local authorities several years ago is believed to have been seized by the Taliban. They were apparently left behind during the withdrawal of U.S. forces. NGOs warned this could expose coalition collaborators even more. Well, to talk more about it, let's cross over to Welton Chang, Chief Technology Officer at Human Rights First. Hello.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for having me.
So what do we actually know so far about what happened, and is it confirmed that the Taliban have seized biometric devices?
Yes, there were reports that the Taliban captured HIDE devices. So these are handheld interagency identification equipment that were part of the coalition forces inventory and perhaps also shared with Afghan national security forces. And these devices may have fallen into the hands of the Taliban during the retreat from various locations in the weeks leading up to the fall of Kabul.
Now, what kind of information does HIDE hold precisely, and how might that endanger local population?
Yeah, so I think it's important to differentiate between the different kinds of biometric systems that are currently in place in Afghanistan. One of those systems that the HIDE is connected to is one that was likely controlled by coalition forces and the U.S. military. We don't know if the Taliban has access directly to those databases, and it seems like there is little information to go on about that. However, there are other biometric databases in the country. The National Identification System has biometrics associated with it, and in the most recent national election, the Afghan government collected biometrics as well. So there are a number of different routes that the Taliban can take to get access to biometric information.
Now, could any of these systems help distinguish those who have collaborated with U.S. forces in the past?
That's the major concern, certainly from our organization as well as some of our allies. It seems that if the Taliban were to have access to the larger database that was collected by coalition forces, inside that database is information about interpreters that we worked with, local nationals that worked on bases, and that information was collected from a number of different populations over many different years. So that's a large data store of information and would contain a treasure trove for identifying people that were associated with aid organizations, human rights defenders, all the way on down to the other vulnerable populations.
Now, Human Rights First has created a guide with tips to try to evade the biometric detection, to try to help save lives. What are some of those tips?
So I think it's also important here to keep in mind that it's actually very difficult, and we state that up front in the guide, to avoid biometric detection. If somebody comes to your residence and sticks a device in front of your face at gunpoint, they're going to get your iris scan or your fingerprint one way or the other. And that is a scenario that the guide isn't necessarily intended to help out with. But there are things that you can do to make it more difficult for somebody to detect your biometrics. For example, making your hands very dry, because the oils and liquid on your hands, that's what allows for that good fingerprint match. Similarly, for your irises, there are ways that you can dilate your pupils and make it more difficult for that detection to happen.
Welton Chang, thank you very much for speaking to us here on Tech 24.
Thank you, Julia.
And it's time now for Test 24. The Paralympic Games are well underway in Tokyo, and the competitors at the pinnacle of their sport spend a lot of money on the most high-performance kits to help them reach the podium. And as budding athletes are watching around the world, it's actually really good news that startups are trying to make accessible technology, well, simply more accessible, I guess.
Yeah, that's right, Julia. Well, as you know, the majority of people around the world with reduced mobility unfortunately don't have access to sport, and the main reason for that is because of high prices of equipment. So for instance, a prosthetic running leg can come in at over 3,500 euros. Designers like Ossur and Ossobok typically aim for pure performance. What I've got here though is a French brand called Hopper, which is actually prioritizing versatility and cost and comfort over pure performance to make their running blade more accessible to as many people as possible. It's collaborated with Salomon to make a sole which is both road and off-road suitable. And fun fact, it's made from scrap carbon fiber provided by Airbus.
So you'll be able to really fly down the running track. Now let's talk about this wheelchair that I have right next to us.
Yes.
Great example of a more inclusive technology.
Yeah, so sports wheelchairs can be up to 6,000 euros. So we've got another French startup here called Playmovin, which makes this sports wheelchair for children. And it's made from recyclable plastic, and it's up to 6 times cheaper than regular ones, meaning kids with disabilities can go out and play rugby, handball and basketball, and an adult version will be launching later this year.
Well, we look forward to it. Thank you very much, Peter, for that. It brings us to the end of this week's edition of Tech 24. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.